Chapter 3 New Enemies Disguised as Friends. The Ghanaian writer A. Adu Bourne in the article The Coming of the Europeans, c. 1440 through 1700, give us the following information about this significant event in history. Africa south of the Sahara has been known to Europeans since Greco-Roman times, but it was not until the fourth decade of the 15th century that they began to arrive in numbers on its shores. The first to come were the Portuguese. They were followed in the 1450s by the Spaniards, who soon after abandoned Africa to explore the Americas. Toward the end of the century, some English and French adventurers and traders arrived. However, their governments were not to give official backing to such enterprise until the 16th and 17th centuries. The Dutch were the next to appear on the African scene, and during the last decade of the 16th century, they effectively challenged the lead enjoyed by the Portuguese. The Danes dropped anchor in 1642, the Swedes in 1647, and the Brandenburgers in 1682. The reason for this sudden surge of interest were partly political, partly economic, partly technological. In the first place, no overseas activities could succeed without the patronage and direction of a strong nation state enjoying stable and peaceful conditions at home, and no such nation state emerged in Europe until after the end of the 14th century, and these continued to be wrecked by foreign and civil wars for another 100 years or more. The nation states of Europe stabilized themselves and developed their economy mainly at the expense of African people. Professor Bourne further tells us that, on balance, then, politically, economically, and socially, the European presence and activities in Africa during the second period were virtually an unmitigated disaster for the Africans. By 1700s, all the great hopes that had been conjured up during the earlier phase of exploration had turned sour. To borrow Basil Davidson's terms, Africa had been then turned into the Black Mother, producing slaves solely in the interest of the growing capitalist system in Europe and the New World, and it was to do this for another 150 years. At the beginning of their contact, sub-Saharan Africa was politically, culturally, and artistically comparable to Europe. By 1700, Europe had leaped forward technologically and socially, but Africa and its black people has become paralyzed and impoverished, a tragedy from which they still have not recovered. In his pamphlet, The Man Who Stole a Continent, John Weatherwax spoke collectively of the British entry into the slave trade. While he used a single figure in relationship to this entry, he was actually referring to the collective assault of Europeans on the west coast of Africa and how the slave trade began a three-continent industry. There was a man who stole a continent, being cruel as well as greedy and possessing power. He enslaved 20 million of his people, sending them over the ocean, 10 million to the eastern hemisphere and 10 million to the western hemisphere. In the process of capturing the 20 million people whom he sold, 80 million other people died, some doing slave raids, for when a village was raided, often the very young and very old and the sick were killed. Some from exposure, disease, and grief during shipment abroad, and some by suicide at the water's edge or in the transit. The sale of 20 million human beings as slaves gave the man hundreds of millions of treasures, but this was only the start of his enrichment. He and his children and grandchildren and those to whom they sold slaves received much, much more, many billions more, through the unpaid labor of whole generations of slaves. But this, too, was not at all end of their enrichment. Professor Weatherwax concludes his analysis of the start of the slave trade in the following manner. For the morality of the man who stole a continent and of his children and grandchildren and ages can only be characterized as the most way out evil this world has ever known. A way out evil is satanic and has only one possible end: to be cast out altogether and forever from the society known as humankind, to be cast into the burning fire which is natural home, to be remembered only by the generation which follows its end, as the most devastating catastrophe that ever befell mankind. The events described by John Weatherwax were the beginning of the African Holocaust and a period of protracted genocide that would change the political character of the world for all times to come. Chapter 4, Slave Trade and Slavery in Retrospect. In this short appraisal of Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, I have reopened and re-examined a much written about subject that is still misunderstood by most people. The basis of this misunderstanding is in the fact that most students of this subject look upon the African slave trade as though it was the only system of slavery known to man. Slavery is an old institution, and there are no people who have not at some time in history been a victim of it. The African slave trade can best be understood if we at least take a brief look at the historical roots of slavery as a world institution. Slavery in ancient societies were appreciably different from the type of slavery that was introduced into Africa by the Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries. In most ancient societies, the slave was held in servitude for a limited time, for a specific reason, and in most cases, the slaves were captured in local wars. Skin color was not a factor as to whether a person did or did not become a slave, and in most cases, the slave had some rights the master had to respect. In ancient Egypt, Kush, Greece, and early Rome, there were clearly defined codes of conduct governing the relationship between the slaves and their masters. Some of the earliest of these codes are recorded in the laws of Moses. In the book, The History of Slavery and the Slave Trade by W.O. Blake, published in 1858, following information related to the early slavery is revealed. The Mosaic institution were rather predicated upon the previous existence of slavery in the surrounding nations, then designed to establish it for the first time, and the provision of the Jewish law upon this subject effected changes and modifications which must have improved the conditions of slaves among that particular people. There were various modes by which the Hebrews might be reduced to servitude. A poor man might sell himself, a father might sell his children, debtors might be delivered as slaves to their creditors. These who were unable to make restitution for the property stolen were sold for the benefit of the sufferers. Prisoners of war were subjected to servitude, and if a Hebrew captive was redeemed by another Hebrew from a Gentile, he might be sold to another Israelite. At the return of the year of Jubilee, all Jewish captives were set free. However, by some writers, it is stated that this did not apply to foreign slaves held in bondage, as over those the master had entire control. The law of Moses provides that if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be surely punished. This restriction is said by some to have applied only to Hebrew slaves and not to foreign captives who were owned by Jews. Mosaic laws declare the terms upon which a Hebrew who had been sold could redeem himself or be redeemed by his friend, and his right to take with him his wife and children when discharged from bondage. The main point of this reference is that the slaves of the ancient world were considered with some humanity. This was nonetheless true of ancient Asia and Africa. In fact, in Africa in both ancient and modern times, slaves have been known to rise above their servitude and become kings in very houses in which they had been slaves. The fact that slavery existed in West Africa prior to contact with Europeans is often used to excuse the European slave trade. The two systems have few similarities. The tragic and distinguished feature of the slave trade that was introduced by the Europeans was that it totally dehumanized the slave. The dehumanization continued in many ways throughout the slavery period and well into the colonial era. This crucial act was supported by a rationale that was created in part by the Christian church and later extended by the writers of the 17th and 18th century. The myth of people with no history and culture comes out of this period. All myths are contagious and one can create many others. This fact can be better understood after some insight into how and why the slave trade came to be. Early in the 15th century, Europe began to recover from the wounds of the Middle Ages and the Crusades. European skills in shipbuilding had improved, and in search of food supply for their hungry population and for worlds to conquer, Europeans began to venture beyond their shores. There are many reasons why the Europeans had not embarked upon worldwide exploration before this time. Their ships were small and unsafe for long sea journeys. Oars were sometimes used to propel these ships, and the outcome of all voyages depended largely on the wind. There was no good maps or instruments to guide sailors through unknown waters. At the time, most Europeans was ignorant about the shape of the world, and some of them thought it was flat. The Portuguese set out to disprove this, and about the middle of the 15th century, they began trading with the people along the west coast of Africa, to which they gave the name Ghana, after the Sudanic Empire of Ghana. At first, they traded mainly in gold, but before long, they began to take slaves also. Social and political unrest began to develop among some of the nations of West Africa at the time. Europe was regaining its strength and a degree of unity. The first Europeans to visit the west coast of Africa did not have to fight their way in. They came as guests and retreated as guests. Later, they decided to stay as conquerors and slave traders. In order to gain a position strong enough to attain these ambitions, they began to take sides in African family disputes, very often supplying the family or tribe they favored with arms and using their favorites as slave catchers. A number of African nations went into the slave trade in order to buy guns and other European manufactured items. Others were forced to capture slaves or become slaves. The Europeans did not come to Africa initially to find slaves. For years they had been hearing stories about the great riches of Africa. At the Battle of Ceuta against the Muslims in 1415, Prince Henry of Portugal, who later became known as Prince Henry the Navigator, heard about the prosperity of Timbuktu and the wealth of the great states along the west coast of Africa. He also heard stories about a great African Christian king named Prester John. Before the end of the 15th century, the Portuguese sailors had come to know the general shape of the continent of Africa. They traded regularly with African countries from 1471 on. Forts were built along the coast of West Africa. The most famous of these forts still in existence is the Lima Castle in what is now Ghana. This fort was started in 1482 by a Portuguese captain, Don Diego de Azambia. Because of the large profits gained by the Portuguese in their trade in this country, they called it the Gold Coast. During the later half of the 15th century, European nationalism was reflected in the expansion of trade in both sales and manufactured goods. The marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand gave Europe the unity to drive out the Arabs and the Moors. Both Spain and Portugal were becoming powerful Mediterranean nations. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz had sailed around the southern tip of Africa about 10 years later. Another Portuguese sailor, Vasco da Gama, sailed past the point reached by Diaz with the help of an Arab pilot. Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. For Europe, the door of the vast world of Asia was open. The rationale for justifying the slave trade had already started in Europe, with Europeans attempting to justify the enslavement of other Europeans. This is a neglected aspect of history that is rarely taken into consideration. There was a concentrated effort to obtain European labor to open up the vast regions of the New World in what became the United States. White enslavement started before black enslavement. In an article, White Servitude in the United States, published in Ebony in November 1969, the Afro-American historian Lerone Bennett Jr. gives the following information about this period. When someone removes the cataracts of whiteness from our eyes, and when we look with unclouded visions of the bloody shadows of the American past, we will recognize for the first time that the Afro-American, who was so often second in freedom, was also second in slavery. Indeed, it will be revealed that the African Americans was third in slavery, for he inherited his change, in a manner of speaking, from the pioneer bondsmen who were red and white. The enslavement of both red men and white men in the early American colonies was a contradiction of English law. The colonies was founded with the understanding that neither chattel slavery nor villeinage would be recognized. Yet forced labor was widely used in England. The system was transferred to the colonies and used to justify a form of slavery that was visited upon red and white men. Concise information on this system and how it developed is revealed in the book Slavery and Abolition, 1831 through 1841, by Albert Bushnell, first published in 1906. It was decreed that the apprentice must serve his 7 years and take flogging as his master saw fit. The hired servant must carry out his contract for his term of service. Convicts of the state, often including political offenders, were slaves of the state and were sometimes sold to private owners overseas. The colonialists claimed those rights over some of their white fellow countrymen. There was a large class of redemptioners who had agreed that their service should be sold for a brief term of years to pay their passage money, and of indentured or indented servants bought by their masters under legal obligation, who served even longer terms, subject to the same penalties of branding, whipping, and mutilation as African slaves. These forms of servitude were supposed to be limited in duration and transmitted no claim to the servant's children. In spite of this servitude, the presumption in law was that a white man was born free. The English settlers had at once began to enslave their Indian neighbors, soothing their conscience with the argument that it was right to make slaves of pagans. In large numbers, the Indians fled or died in captivity, leaving few of their descendants in bondage. The virgin soil of the New English settlements continued to need more labor. This led to a fierce search for white laborers that subsequently led to a search for black labor. Bennett continues, quote, "It has been estimated that at least 2 out of every 3 white colonists worked for a term of years in the fields of kitchen as semi-slaves. White servitude was the historic foundation upon which the system of black slavery was constructed," unquote.